This is Duke University.
We're going to begin with our second panel for today, which is Black Women in the Diaspora. Our first panelist is Natalie Bullock Brown, award-winning and Emmy-nominated producer. She's an assistant professor of film and broadcast media at St. Augustine's University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's currently producing and directing a documentary exploring the impact of beauty ideals on Black women, tentatively titled Baartman, Beyonce, and Me. She was a co-host of UNC TV's Black Issues Forum and an associate producer on Ken Burns' 10-part PBS series, Jazz. She holds an MFA from Howard University and a BA from Northwestern University. The title of her presentation is The Big Embrace, Blackness, Beauty, and Sisterhood.
As Sasha mentioned, I am working on a feature-length documentary called Baartman, Beyonce, and Me. And what I'd like to share with you is what's called the work sample for that film. It's essentially a demo of the larger piece, which I am going to be using to fundraise for the feature-length project. But I thought it might be totally appropriate to show it to you, given the title of this panel, Black Women in the Diaspora, because the Baartman in the title of my film is Sarah Baartman, who was also known as the Hottentot Venus, and she was a 19th century South African woman. So we're really kind of getting everybody involved in this film. So we'll show you the piece. It's about 14 and a half minutes, and then I have a few things I'd like to share with you to contextualize and sort of tell you how I'm thinking about the film at this point, especially in the midst of the Trump era.
Could that change how we see us from the inside out?
I want to start off my remarks with a quote from Tina McElroy Ansa, who's a writer, a novelist. I met her some years ago, and something that she said to me that I will never forget is that I need Black women, and this is in quotes, in my life. I need Black women in my life, and I get all up in their face until they give it up. So with that in mind, let me share with you some things that I've been thinking about regarding this work. During the days and weeks following the election of Donald J. Trump, in the midst of my sorrow and grieving, I wondered if Baartman, Beyonce, and Me meant anything at all. It felt trivial, like whining about beauty, not substantive or necessary. But I was encouraged by friends and colleagues who reminded me that part of my resistance is my art and my determination to complete it, no matter who is in office. In fact, this time in direct defiance of who is in office. I'm realizing also that this film can do work towards feminist movement, especially in the wake of the women's marches and the challenge that intersectional thinking still presents for white feminists. Our quote unquote common oppression seems to still be the centerpiece around which white feminists expect Black women to circle. But as Black women of the diaspora, I think it is most important that we spend some time circling around our own wagons to freely express our struggles and pain, even as we celebrate the many ways who we are gives life, produces magic, and yields a special kind of joy. The big embrace of ourselves as Black women, because we deserve and need each other, could give way to a different expression of feminism if we were to boldly explore together each issue that is unique to our experiences, whether the impact of beauty ideals or respectability politics and class divisions, or any other thing. And this is what I think we will have to do more of over the next 4 years and beyond. Identify and give voice to the nuances of our intersectional lives as a way to carve out more space for ourselves within this white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and within feminist movement. Bell Hooks, in her book, Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, explains that, quote, any movement to resist the co-optation of feminist struggle must begin by introducing a different feminist perspective, a new theory, one that is not informed by the ideology of liberal individualism. I submit that the beauty ideal and the ways that it has impacted the lives of Black women and girls, among other things, has helped to foster in Black women an ideology of liberal individualism, which fosters competition among other toxic manifestations, in part because we have not been willing to make ourselves vulnerable in the presence of our sisters. Instead of similarity, we have harped on difference, light skin versus dark skin, European features versus African features, quote unquote good and bad hair, big bodies versus skinny ones, and every issue in between. However, the bottom line is that we need each other, especially now, or perhaps now just amplifies the fact that we have needed each other all along. Through Baartman, Beyonce, and me, I am envisioning a growing community of Black women who increasingly reject this ideology of liberal individualism in favor of a sisterhood that names and affirms every aspect of our experiences, even when mainstream feminism will not and cannot, and white supremacist capitalist patriarchy seeks to erase us. Tina Ansa says, quote, I need Black women in my life. I say, I do too. We all do. Let's get all up in each other's faces and affirm our own and each other's glorious Black beauty until we give it up. Thank you.
I'll begin with an epigraph. Central to the impression the pictures make on us is that there are a large number of them with the same setting and cast in a variety of poses, from the most natural to the most self-curious, and degree of dress and undress. Yet they are part of a series is what gives the photographs their integrity, their depth, their meaning. Each individual picture is informed by the meaning that attaches to the whole group. Most obviously, it could not be detected from at least a third of the pictures that the women are inmates in a brothel. Susan Sontag. Florestine Bro, or at least the one found in the police archive, demands some measure of mystery. Her photograph first appears in the Orleans Parish Police Department's archives in 1908. The only reason given for her arrest, suspicion. From the scant details on the back of the cardboard affixed to her mugshot, we can glean a life left only in traces. Born in Brooks of Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana in the early 1890s, Brew grew up in a time and place that would have faintly recalled the Jubilee of Emancipation, while still enmeshed in slavery's legal and social afterlives. The small town located just to the northeast of Baton Rouge consisted mostly of rural farmland at the time. There's no discernible way, in the archive or outside of it, to know what prompted Bro's journey to the city, or whether she made the approximately 115-mile trip to New Orleans alone or with family. The only record of her life outside of the police archives comes as a single line listing her name and address in a guidebook to the women of the Storyville Vice District. In the section for colored prostitutes, the line reads, Bro, Florena, 226 North Robertson. Bro's 1920 mugshot card is her final appearance in this archive, and as close as we come to a final official record of her life. In existence from 1897 till its closure by the federal government in 1917, Storyville, or as the district as it would also be known, was a 16 square block area of New Orleans, just across Basin Street above the French Quarter, within which all vice and women, to quote the law, publicly known as sex workers were mandated by law to be confined professionally and residentially. Of the few archives that remain from Storyville, and there's no singular Storyville archive. The Orleans Parish Police Department's collection of mugshots, corresponding glass plate negatives, and Bertillon cards is perhaps the largest, but also where we find Bro and thousands of other women, many of whom were Black, whose occupation was listed as prostitute, and address given as within the district's boundaries. And here we might consider again the final line of Sontag's quote from the Epigraph, in which the connection between inmate and brothel are the necessary signifiers of this arrangement we might otherwise call home. For today's talk, however, I would borrow and extend this formulation to consider how the proximity of work and home orients our relationship to this archive and cautions whatever relationship we might hope to have to Florestine Bro and other Black women whose place in the police records are inextricable from other such violent encounters with the archives which came before and are still to come. By examining Perot's police record, specifically her Bertillon card, I would suggest that there is a tripartite relationship between home, labor, which we should also be thinking here as criminality, and the archive that enables such crucial questions as how do we think something as seemingly fundamental as home or belonging in a space that so thoroughly represents the historical indistinction between what Saidiya Hartman has referred to as slavery's afterlives and the burdened individuality of freedom, or where the distinction between this Black woman's labor, central and fundamental to each of these historical constructions, and her home are similarly collapsed. The archive. In a 1909 address delivered at the Franklin Institute of Pennsylvania's Popular Science series, biometricist Percifor Fraser detailed the organizational logic of Alphonse Bertillon's system of criminal identification. Quote, "The function of the anthropometric service is to obtain from the prisoners brought to it a certain number of osseous measurements, using the figures thus obtained as a basis to classify the photographs of individuals after the manner of a classification of flora, etc., to enable one ultimately to find, in a collection destined to contain several 100,000 specimens, the portrait of an old offender who has concealed his identity under a false name and a disguise." What's currently on the screen right now is a blank version of the front of one of Bertillon's cards, which you can sort of see in the middle there above the title description is where the photograph would go. Above that, there's a sort of the different bone measurements, which could be everything from an earlobe to an index finger. It was sort of this premised on this belief of the sort of symmetry of a body, right? The Bertillon system took hold as a reliable, increasingly indispensable tool for police in major urban centers with growing criminal populations, and New Orleans was no exception. It's unclear when they adapted the system, but my best guess would probably be around 1910 for roughly about a decade until fingerprinting took hold as sort of the 20th century's major biometric technology, right? Developed to take advantage of both photographs and physiognomic technologies at the time, the system of cataloging served several purposes. First, they offered an archive of known criminals whose status could be verified through irrefutable photographic and measured evidence. Second, it worked in concert with the claim of physiognomy, producing data sets of criminal types with its measurement protocols. Following Fraser, the photographic historian Alan Sekula described Bertillonage as, quote, a bipartite system positioning the microscopic individual record within a macroscopic aggregate, close quote. Bertillon's detailed system of measurement lent itself to a repetitive performance of data collection between the officer and the arrested, producing what the inventor called a, quote, rigorous exactitude. Such exactitudes were premised on the beliefs of each individual body's inherent symmetry between appendages as opposed to a body envisioned as a whole. And these precise bodily coordinates would remain as true to the individual as their given name. To this end, the photographs on the front of each card were meant to be subordinate, a mere secondary form of identification meant to confirm the data which surrounded it. Roland Barthes would describe this interaction of text and image as follows, quote, the text constitutes a parasitic message designed to connote the image. The verbal message seems to share in its objectivity. The connotation of language is innocented through the photograph's denotation. close quote. What's up on the screen now is the back of Florentine Bro's card from mid-August 1912. The desire for objectivity presents itself in the formalization of this card and its reliance on measurable data. This is only redoubled on the rear of the card, wherein Bro's personal information is detailed in a manner that presents a violent topography of her body. In the section entitled Marks, Scars, and Moles, there appears a lengthy list of scars to her forehead, jaw, and ear, in addition to reference to a tattoo, ear piercing, and her false hair. In reading the notes in her record, one gets a sense that Bro's hands and face are littered with scars. Her forearm is adorned with a sentimental tattoo. The officer's note reads, tattoo, initials PD, and heart. The consistent notation of this tattoo throughout Bro's record, 1908, 1912, 1920, refers to what art historian Paige Dubois called in her book Slave and Other Objects, quote, the marking of otherness fortifying the connection of Bro's body to her record in the archive. The particularity of Bro's description is one example of how markings are crucial to the efficiency of Bertillon's system. Bertillon notes the effectiveness of utilizing a standard scientific vocabulary when recording an individual's unique corporeal features. In the opening passage of the section, Statement on Peculiar Marks, from his 1896 treatise, Bertillon writes, quote, the obligation of describing and localizing the peculiarities in a manner at once brief and accurate necessitates the use of some anatomical terms, close quote. What emerges at first as an ordinarily banal directive, the insistence on anatomical terms in the production of records foreshadows Hortense Spiller's observation, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, on the narration of a scene of torture enacted on the enslaved. Quoting from Spiller's, the anatomical specifications of rupture, of altered human tissue, take on the objective description of laboratory prose. Eyes beaten out, arms, backs, skulls branded, a left jaw, a right ankle, punctuated, teeth missing, as the calculated work of iron, whips, chains, knives, the canine patrol, the bullet. These undecipherable markings on the captive body render a kind of hieroglyphics of the flesh, whose severe disjunctures come to be hidden, the cultural seeing, by skin color. We might well ask, is this phenomenon in marking and branding actually transfers from one generation to another? Close quote. The distinction Spillers makes in the text preceding this passage between the body and the flesh as the, quote, central distinction between captive and liberated subject positions bears on the archive's record of Bro insofar as the marking on and of the captive body, and Bro is certainly a captive in this moment, have been subsumed and transformed under Bertillon's system, demonstrating the discursive and material continuities between the two. The historical meaning of marked bodies and flesh is repurposed in the space of this card, enacting the transfers of injury and rupture. This language, what Spillers might call a hieroglyphics, emerges for Bro and in Storyville as the body that scientific policing pulled apart and haphazardly put back together. The combination of Bro's measurements and the descriptive markings produce what we may call an aggregate body, following Sakula, or a body fully realized only through the aggregate. In order to accomplish the necessary accumulation and ordering of such disparate data, the individual body must undergo a process similar to the excerpt above that Spillers defines here as pornotroping. Insofar as the body is only useful to the system of Bertillonage as a unit of measurement, the observed, measured, and recorded flesh becomes the raw material of classification and identification. The marks, scars, and moles annotated for the archive place the flesh at the center of the inscription of criminality. The centrality of the flesh-body distinction within Bertillonage exposes the system's structural proximity to discourses and technologies of enslavement. And here, Spillers articulates the material continuity between these archives. Following this connection, we see that both are premised on and are organized by what we might call economies of the flesh. This phrase, however, is not singular along a proposed material and epistemological continuum. Instead, we must consider an archival economy that is able to reconcile both the demands of capital expansion and with corporeal contraction, both of which rely on the notion of the flesh. And I'll skip ahead a little bit here because I know that the description of the archive drags a little, but I'm happy to elaborate a little bit further on what my meaning here is by economies of the flesh. Indeed, this is the problem set up by the archive. In utterly inhospitable inhospitable, recalling Derrida's warning in Archive 4 affording an impression, quote, "It is thus in this domiciliation, in this house arrest, that archives take place. The dwelling, this place where they dwell permanently, marks this institutional passage from public to private, from private to the public, which does not always mean from the secret to the non-secret," close quote. The purported historical secret of Bro's life laid bare in the archive is just one of the trappings of what it means to be, quote, "a publicly known woman." In this final section, I would like to turn to the yet-to-be-displayed photograph of Florestine Bro, an aspect of Bertillon's system that was largely procedural, and what I hope you all noted was immaterial actually to the narration of this archive, as its violent appropriation of the technologies of enslavement. Instead, in this archive's wake, I would turn back to Bro's mugshot to consider the role the photograph might play in and against, again echoing Bart, this parasitic message. The two images are stunningly clear, with the light casting a glare on only one side of her face, the other side draped in shadow. Her wig removed, and the aforementioned photograph from her previous mugshot can be seen tucked behind the front profile images necessary for the Bertillon card. The photographs are formal in nature. Her bodily comportment suggests the positioning demanded of her, surely the case in a process that demands repetitive precision. Bro offers a blank yet resistant gaze in the face of her incarceration, a look that suggests and is affirmed by her record that she has in fact been through this process before, not to presume that her body depicts a complacent resignation, but rather an experiential knowledge that serves her well in her routine encounters with the law. The partially torn garment just barely exposes the left side of her clavicle. Coupled with Bro's slight frame, her clothes invoke images of poverty and destitution, in comparison to the manner in which Storyville itself has presented its high-end brothels as opulent and extravagant. The dress she is wearing appears to be what is known as a Mother Hubbard, what historian Mar L. Keir described as garb for, quote, "prostitutes in down marketplaces." She continues, "sack-like dresses that went on and came off easily," close quote. Such down market spaces were often called cribs, shotgun-style houses partitioned into 12, 18 separate rooms, usually by nothing more than a cloth. If any of you have ever spent any time in New Orleans and you know a shotgun-style house, if you can imagine maybe a one-bedroom that gets partitioned into, up to 18 rooms. And finally, we see the number 1589. It's inscribed right on the front profile, I guess what would be her right shoulder blade, coming down her shoulder blade. Bro's call number for the handwritten police index of sex workers in the district etched onto the photograph. In one sense, this graphic inscription is one more place where the residues of Bertillon's system haunt the image. At the same time, there's a sense in which the mark joins the photograph, I would suggest, in resisting the attended effect of archival, biographical, and corporeal individuation, and offers the traces of a life lived otherwise elsewhere and with others. The photograph's centrality to understandings of subjecthood and citizenship during this period spans the entirety of the social body, both criminal and respectable. The advent and organization of criminal archives by municipal police departments did not merely produce a spectrum of social actors awaiting categorization. They also, crucially, bear the trace of those individuals and communities whose everyday lives were routinely affected by the interventions of policing and its specific mechanisms of control. Bro's photographs offer fleeting traces of such a life alongside and against the evidence of criminality. Bro's dress, bodily comportment, and resistant gaze signal a mode of social life that eludes us when we ask her to fulfill a desire for recovery in the same moment that we have confused our own discovery with hers. In the absence of any autobiographical narrative, it would be easy to fill the gaps with the familiar narrative of women leaving their rural homes for urban centers and succumbing to the wickedness of the flesh trade in this iteration. But what remains at stake in Illuminating Bro's life and the manner in which it has been recorded is not merely to reassert the evils that permeate and move across all crimes against the flesh, but rather to imagine what mode of narrative recovery are made possible in photographic traces that offer a way out rather than a way back in. When does it become possible to imagine the scene in which the slipperiness of such notions of home and work give way to spaces of belonging and social life? Is it possible through such visual material traces that we can imagine a scene, perhaps, in which Bro hears hushed voices, discreet movements through a thinly veiled partition, after which she rises and exits from her room at the back of the crib. Walking down the long hallway, she runs her fingers along the bed sheets hung from the ceiling, there to create the illusion of privacy. Whispers between partitions, jokes and stories exchanged in hallways and on porches, tips for safety and knowledge of the trade, and of course, her inevitable departure to wherever it is they called home. Thank you.
So this is a departure kind of from a dissertation chapter that I'm working on that is considering freed Black women in the Middle Mississippi River Valley who decided to stay in slave states after they were emancipated or purchased their freedom. So this is kind of, I say it's a departure from that because I am very much invested in some of the themes that we were talking about in the last panel, like emancipatory strategies of spatial organization. But the archive is something that I have to deal with as a historian. So I have to deal with the kind of the tensions that is bringing to me. So I hope that you will embrace those tensions with me and kind of help me think through this. So, and I think something, sorry, this is a long introduction. Something that you said in the comments was really, it really struck me when you were talking about the trauma of holding on to the land. And I think that kind of gets at some of what's going on in this paper. So in attempting to draw the connection between the theme of this conference and my research on free and enslaved women in the Middle Mississippi River Valley, I was quickly reminded of the limitations of what can be known of 19th century Black women's intimate lives and of what I can reasonably argue they thought, let alone imagined or dreamed of their future. The content of their inner lives evades us even though we fashion endless methods of reading against and along the archival grain. And scholars bear the risk of enacting more violence on those historical actors as we try to represent their fears and desires in ways that reflect our own. But what's allowed me to enter this conversation is the intersection between time and space. Specifically, I wish to explore how the meaning antebellum Black women made of space had consequences for both their futures and our own. So in this paper, I'll consider two enslaved women's pursuits of liberty and ask where they located freedom or their Black futures and why. Historians have begun to borrow from critical geographers in their use of spatially oriented frameworks to interpret antebellum Black life and especially resistance. Stephanie Camp, Anthony Kay, and Vincent Brown are just a few scholars that have identified alternative geographic constructs that emerge from the actions of the enslaved. These scholars conceptualize geography in abstract ways that allow us to see old sources with new eyes and perhaps even create new archives. Scholarship on fugitivity and marriage similarly demotes white imperialist and patriarchal constructions of space in favor of geographic organizations that emerge from the bottom up. I too have adopted this methodology and it has borne fruitful insights. My work considers the geography of freedom as it was both perceived and mapped by free and enslaved Black women in the Middle Mississippi River Valley. I seek to understand from their vantage where freedom could be had or made, if anywhere, and just as importantly, where it could not. However, I've learned that their alternative, competing geographic constructs were always in dialogue with the dominant spatial constructs that I wish to complicate. What I mean here is that it's quite useful methodologically to think about geography in the abstract. We can't forget or dismiss the fact that antebellum Black men and women were aware of the real geopolitical context in which they acted. So it was in this context of an expanding, cohering, yet fractured and imperializing nation state that they deliberated over and determined where freedom was and was not. Throughout the antebellum period, Black leaders weighed in on or initiated their own colonization schemes to the western coast of Africa or the Caribbean or elsewhere, and others, if they did not flee to Canada or Mexico or the Dismal Swamp, deliberated collectively and individually over the choice to remain in the slave South, subject to the principles of and in precarious proximity to slavery, or live as second-class citizens in the free North. I wish to suggest that those choices not only set the geographic terrain for future generations of struggle, but also define parameters for future debates around Black citizenship, identity, and subjecthood vis-a-vis the state. So now I'm going to give like a narrative of these two women's struggles for freedom to give us something concrete to think about these themes. So in the 1850s, two enslaved women in Tennessee named Lucinda and Susan would engage in a legal contest over their freedom that would last nearly a decade. Susan and Lucinda were freed by their master's will, and their late owner, Michael Smith Petter's death in October 1856, Carrick Nelson and David Smith Petter, they were executors of the deceased will, initiated the procedure to have the women removed to Liberia, according to a recently passed law requiring the removal of free persons of color from the state to the western coast of Africa. It would have been the executor's duty, according to the law, to file a petition in the court for the women's removal and to have them serve with notice of the petition. The initial petition was filed in June of 1857, but Susan and Lucinda would not receive the order until April of the following year, when the court ordered the sheriff to serve the women and also appointed them counsel in order to offer an answer to the complainants. Finally, in October of 1858, Susan and Lucinda, by an attorney, by their counsel, offered their interpretation of their late master's will and accordingly submitted their desires to the court in response to the executor's initiation of their removal. Their first wish was to remain in the state as free persons because, as they understood their condition, they had every right to by law and by their late owner's will. The deceased wished, quote, that my two slaves, Susan and Lucinda, shall be emancipated if the laws of the land will permit them to remain in the state, or if they or either of them shall prefer to go to a free country, and if not, then they shall have and enjoy a quasi-freedom in this country, and shall have the right of managing and making for themselves. On those grounds, their attorney argued that being allowed to remain in the state would not be incompatible with the laws of Tennessee. It seems that he may not have even known about the 1854 law that required them to go to West Africa. He argued that unless some other intervening law, which they are not informed of, compels them to remove to Liberia, the women could legally remain. The answer went on. If it were in fact consistent with the law that they be permitted to remain in the state, they wished to remove to a free state in the country. And finally, if left with the choice between slavery and immigration to West Africa, at the time they concluded, quote, after much study and penetration of mind, that they would remove to Liberia, believing that freedom in a foreign country is preferable to slavery here. It's a quote from the petition. So the case was postponed once more and resumed in April of 1859. The court then issued a decree that allowed although Susan and Lucinda were in fact entitled to their right to freedom, they could not exercise that freedom in the state of Tennessee, and thus did not legally reserve the power of election to emigrate to a free state. And they must then go to West Africa. The court ordered that the county clerk continue to hire the women out until the governor or other proper authority required that they start on their journey. It appeared that Susan and Lucinda's fate had been sealed, but in the following months, the women would take their futures into their own hands. In the October term of 1859, Susan submitted another petition to the court. Both she and Lucinda had accepted different fates than the court sought to execute that were probably unimaginable to the women a year before. In their first answer to Nelson and Smith Petter's petition, Susan and Lucinda seemed appalled at the new, exciting law that allowed for the voluntary enslavement of free persons of color in the state. They claimed they preferred freedom in a foreign country over slavery in Tennessee, especially considering that law, which would offer one the right to choose a master, but allowed that person to sell them again at their will and perhaps force them to be slaves of those who might prove hard and cruel masters. That's their interpretation. But Susan petitioned the court to do just that. She elected to enslave herself to one Jacob Wagner. She conveyed the full weight of this decision to the court, explaining that in part her affection had induced her to take this course. Susan had recently been married to an enslaved man belonging to the Wagners, the family to whom she had been hired out during the pendency of the case. Rather than fall back into the executor's hand, she hoped to happily spend her days, this is a quote, as the slave of her selected master and the wife of her present husband. But the first reason Susan gave the court for wishing to be re-enslaved was that she had lost her friend and companion. Susan explained that Lucinda, quote, she is sorry to say, destroyed herself by her own hand, perhaps because she felt she would be compelled to leave the land of her nativity and take up her residence in a strange land and among people she knows not. So death and re-enslavement may be represented as failures in Susan and Lucinda's struggle for freedom, but if so, not without recognition of the control, however limited, they attempted to exert over their fate. So what does this have to do with the history of Black legal and political subjectivity? Scholars like Martha Jones and Ariella Gross have demonstrated that the act of allowing Black men and women to petition antebellum courts paved the way to juridical agency. In their pursuit of freedom, Black women like Susan and Lucinda cultivated legal expertise through their experiences with jailers, attorneys, judges, and other Black litigants. Whether these encounters occurred by choice or coercion, in the process they developed knowledge and awareness of not only local structures of governance, but also their own legal personhood. I think this experience contributed to the meaning antebellum Blacks like Susan and Lucinda attached not just to the space they inhabited, but to their place within it. And it's possible that the experience or performance of legal subjectivity and even citizenship to some extent foreclosed or undermined alternative geographic imaginaries of freedom. This is like the tension that I don't like, but so by the time Susan and Lucinda were indicted by the executor of their late owner's will for continuing to illegally reside in the state, the American Colonization Society was operating as an immigration agency. It had retreated from its administrative role in Liberia and ordered the colony to proclaim its independence. The ACS boasted that they received written requests from free Blacks to participate in the early expeditions to West Africa. But since its inception, many Black leaders from the Northeast denounced the Society's efforts as exploitative of the Black condition and proposed alternative segregationist plots, such as the establishment of an internal Black colony. Susan and Lucinda may have shared those sentiments, but I think their opposition to immigration constitutes a converging yet distinct point of origin of Black citizenship claims making in the US. It's likely, and Susan's petition suggests, that like many other freed Blacks, the women chose to remain in the place where they had been held in slavery, in large part because freedom meant little in the absence of community and a sense of belonging. But is it possible that Susan and Lucinda came to their own understanding of the latent or potential leverage that was attached to one's legibility to the state? To be sure, they didn't have much reason to think they stood to benefit from such legibility. And in other parts of my project, I talk about how Black women controlled their exposure to state power and sought to avoid the gaze altogether. But here I'm just interested in what happened when they did engage the law. So the justices of the Johnson County Court did not explicitly invoke the Dred Scott decision, but they arrived at kindred conclusions, claiming that the laws operating in the state of Tennessee at the time precluded even a quasi-freedom for Susan and Lucinda if their emancipation was confirmed through the court. Freedom would result in their immediate severance, of their relationship to the state of Tennessee. By volunteering to re-enslave herself to the owner of her choosing, Susan realigned herself with the state as an enslaved person and a married woman. Perhaps Susan's highly instructive encounters with her attorney and the courts helped her better comprehend or embody her subject position, recognize the legal and material boundaries of citizenship, and ultimately contributed to her choice to remain within a legal framework within which she was legible, but one that was also legible to her. The potential loss of her legal agency may have further constituted the strangeness of other lands. This isn't to say that she didn't forego that agency by re-enslaving herself, but she had had this experience with the law. She knew that the laws changed and that there were these openings for making legal claims. And so here I think there's some space for a possibility that she and Lucinda may have had a picture of the future in which they could have been free that was worth holding on to for them. Lucinda's case is a bit more complicated to consider in these terms, but to do so I think is still worthwhile. In her book, The Power to Die, Terry Snyder examines slave suicide in British North America and interprets self-murder as an act of resistance. Snyder also traces the significance of slave suicide to anti-slavery politics from the publication of The Dying Negro, a late 18th century poem widely considered as the first piece of anti-slavery propaganda, through 19th century narratives of former slaves that use references to slave suicide to dispel the myth of the institution's benevolence. But it appears that Lucinda's suicide confronted not slavery, but freedom. I don't think I need to illustrate the point that the women were not at all ambivalent about their condition as slaves. In their petition, they explicitly stated that they would choose freedom anywhere over slavery, and this was a desperate choice. But I raised the point just to suggest that there was something unconscionable for Lucinda about the idea that she would be forced to leave her place of birth in order to be free. If slave suicide can be interpreted as a spectacular affront to the injustices of slavery, then by her self-murder, what exactly did Lucinda mean to reject? Or I wonder, what did she declare about her entitlement to freedom in this country? David Smith-Petter, the executor of the late Michael Smith-Petter's estate, was relentless. He accused the women of murdering their late owner and appealed the court's approval of Susan's petition for re-enslavement. But it would not be until after the Civil War that the Tennessee Supreme Court heard the case. In the fall of 1865, the court ruled that the terms of the case were no longer legally material. The decision read, "It is now unnecessary to determine the questions raised in the record in reference to the right of the girl Susan to go into voluntary servitude. The amended Constitution of the state of Tennessee prohibits slavery or voluntary servitude, and it has ceased forever to exist." Susan and Lucinda may not have known what future lay just ahead of them, that freedom struggles such as theirs would lead to war and constitutional amendment that wholly redefined the terms of citizenship in a reconstituted nation. Susan's choice to stay and Lucinda's objection to being forced to leave, although certainly acts of desperation, can and should be aligned with the historical but enduring pursuit of full citizenship and liberty taken up by and for Black people in this country. Theirs and many later Black freedom struggles exhibit that Black futures carry a legacy of contests over the occupation of space, and that past choices about where freedom lies have literally and ideologically molded the ground on which we struggle and dream of liberation today. Thank you.
One of the things that all three talks made me think about was sort of what are the different types of technologies that are used to capture Black womanhood? There's another way that we could have named this panel In Search of Black Women, and sort of thinking about how do we then position ourselves to these various different stories filmically. Natalie Bullock Brown's talk really made me think about, so what does it mean for us to reinscribe ourselves in that history and sort of to draw out the narrative? Alicia's paper made me think about the different ways that we go after these different women and sort of start to reposition the stories again and then reinscribe them and imagine for them what the possibility of freedom looked like and what it meant for them to reside in a certain type of place. Nick's talk, interestingly, made us really take into consideration the photograph and literally walked us through what those different steps look like. How have the different technologies changed over time such that we can still have these conversations in various different decades? And so I'll leave it at that, but I do want to open it up to questions. But again, thank you all for wonderful presentations. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you all so much for all of your offerings. I love talking about Black women, so I'm excited. I'm in thinking again across the two panels today, I'm thinking about how you all went back to the archive, and I think even in kind of what came out in the first panel was in thinking about and trying to think or begin to think about Black futures, we have to return to a beginning, right? We have to return to a history. And so I'm interested in how sometimes when we talk about like the creation of Blackness and we talk about the archive and like the figuration or figures of like the Black maternal, Black femininity, Black womanhood get left out of that, right? Like they get left out of that picture, that imagery, that archive. And so in thinking about like a move forward into a future, I'm wondering what you guys think about where does the figure of the Black woman show up, right? I think particularly when we think about freedom struggles, right? The forward movers, kind of like the grassroots people, have always been Black women, right? And they've been doing that labor, pushing it forward. And so what I'm thinking about, or what I'm thinking across all of you, is just like, where do Black women show up in this future, right? Like, are Black women the ones that are going to take us forward, right? I guess that's really what I'm thinking about. Like, if we're thinking about creation and the Black woman as kind of like the crux of history, of the world, of everything that we know, then like, is she at the crux of this future that we're trying to envision?
I'm a historian, so I can't really escape the archive. But I think in terms of like the future, the 19th century Black futures, I guess, what I find interesting in the archives that I use, which are mediated in a lot of different ways and violent in a lot of different ways, are that Black women show up kind of detached from communities and detached from men in interesting ways. And so I want to see kind of what the legacy of that is in the post-emancipation world, and because we have these kinds of ideas about the Black family, or the enslaved woman's experience, and how that, or experiences in the household, and like how that translates in freedom. And so I think in thinking about the future, you have to think about the positionality, I guess, of Black women within family, within community, how that acts on their ideas about gender and things like that. So, yeah, that's what I think.
I'm still thinking.
Me too. I mean, that's an incredible question. And I think I am not a historian, but I do keep going back to the archive. And I think precisely because a lot of my questions are informed by some of the things I tried to say at the beginning of my paper about that people like Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spillers articulate so brilliantly, right? Is that there are moments and times that we can these spaces that we can call history, the archive, in which the moment we think we have a clear delineation between bodies, people, names, is precisely that moment when they sort of those distinctions become undone in really violent and terrible ways, right? And so my interest in the archive is always sort of trying to chronicle or place some kind of genealogy on the continuities of those processes. And I think, so in that regard, it's difficult for me to think about a futurity sometimes because I'm so bogged down in the sort of looking back, right, to sort of figure out this moment. But I mean, and that's a long way of saying, I think that these sort of critiques of the archive, these critiques that attempt to position or think about Black women or Black womanhood by Black women themselves or other folks are like, have been going on already. Like, you didn't need me to tell you that the archive was a problematic place, right? But I think that, I think of people like M. Nor Bessie Phillip or the artist Renee Green, who are sort of really trying to think forwardly about not merely the figure of the Black woman, but Black women themselves, right? In a sort of aesthetic capacity that also has the ability to speak back to that genealogy that I guess my paper was trying to, in some small way, in this small corner of the world, articulate as problematic.
I would say, it's a great question. And two things came to mind, which I'll kind of sum up by saying that I think Black women we're ride or die. I mean, we're central to a lot of things that I think take place in our communities, in this country. We do labor to try and correct and promote and push forward. I think the ideals that, at the end of the day, support all of us. I'm thinking about the fact that 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. That regardless of what you think about Hillary, if it had gone that way, we wouldn't be dealing with what we have going on now. I think of also a quote that comes from a white man, ironically, but I told you all that the quote that I mentioned to you is from Tina McElroy Ansa, or Tina Ansa McElroy. And when I posted that quote, I posted it on Facebook a couple of years ago, and Dr. Tim Tyson, who teaches history here, responded that, you know, he was like, if I could, I would go back to somewhere he had been working where everyone that ran that place was a Black woman. And he was like, Black women need to just run the country and we'd be good. And I kind of, and it really resonated with me. I cannot remember the names of the women that he had, like specific women that he was like, somebody needs to be president, and Eleanor Holmes Norton needs to be this, and but he just named a litany of women. But I guess the point is that I think we are where we are right now, the way that we show up right now is what we're going to continue to do because that's who we are. I think what I hope, and a part of what I was trying to say in my remarks and that I'm certainly trying to get across in my film, is that there has to be space for Black women. Like, there has to be not only space, but recognition of the ways that we do show up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. And that support, that recognition, that affirmation, and that ride or die attitude, like, can we get some of that too? That, like, we need that. And so that is what I hope will be a part of our future, that we will be centered more than we are currently.
So, directed at all three of you in light of certainly it's always appropriate to ask the filmmaker where are you going, or what you're thinking, or what do you see in some regard in a final product. And so in that regard, with the other two panelists, you've given us a piece of what you've done. And so what I'm interested in is, where are you taking us with what you shared, and certainly with what you're hoping to complete in the final reel. And so, yes, what do we see in the final reel from each of you?
I can go. Yeah, I mean, as Sasha said, I'm defending my dissertation in March 27th, so I'm almost there. You know, and this project, I think I have had to come to reconcile myself with the fact that so much of this project is just simply about what I don't know, or figuring out what I don't know. And part of working through that is working with the archive itself. Some of which, you know, supports what I said today, and some of which runs pretty counter to it. And those are sort of tensions I'm trying to figure out right now. I think Reggie had the question earlier, I think he took off, about a space in which, he was talking about on the sea, right, to John, after John's paper, about the way sort of racial categories get produced, categories of gender get produced in certain spaces, and Storyville is one of those. You know, as I was answering the last question, to me, one of those spaces at the turn of the 20th century where things kind of get mixed up a little, and the archive doesn't necessarily bear out clear distinctions and answers for us. So in part, I'm always hesitant, and I'm currently hesitant to prescribe for the women I find in this archive what I think their life should look like or should have looked like. What that means in the scope of a major project is, you know, the title of this paper is sort of not a jab, but like a critique of Alan Sekula's famous article, "The Body in the Archive," which sort of continually places the body at the center of 19th century and 20th century criminal archives, and I'm arguing it's the flesh, right? We have to think about the flesh. And so what's next in that regard is, I mean, I don't know, to be honest. Like, I'll defend the dissertation, hopefully. And then I have to go back to the archive, because there's literally thousands of images of people who've just been sort of deserted in the New Orleans Public Library. You know, have been sitting there since 1922. So for me, I've just got to go back and learn some more.
I'm not as close to finishing my dissertation, but what I hope to do with my dissertation is just make the case that my methodology works, like following Black women kind of moving around and disrupting spatial geographic constructs based on their own pursuits of freedom and just life and work and family and happiness is just is a viable methodology from which we can begin our historical, research and consideration of them. So I hope that I can do that in the end, but I'm not there yet.
There's all kinds of things that I want to do, and then at the same time, I mean, with each new day, really, I mean, the film sort of tells me where I need to go, but I will say that there are a couple of things that I really want to accomplish, and how I end up accomplishing them, I'm not sure, but I do want to show the lineage. I want to show how Sarah Baartman is sort of, she's one bookend. For me, Beyonce, for the most part, is that other bookend. And then, from Sarah Baartman to Michelle Obama and Serena Williams and Black women in between. I want to show that we are, or demonstrate that, no matter celebrity or where you are, where you were positioned in history, that we have this incredible, I guess, legacy that's both painful, but also has the potential to be illuminating, I think, that I want to pull out. I also want to, I think that there's something to be said about the lack of representation, the lack of affirmation in culture, that, and the impact that has on a young Black female mind and heart, and how psychologically, it can cause you, and you don't have to be young, actually, you can be middle-aged or older, and make decisions about what you're gonna do with your life, who you're gonna marry, where you're gonna go, where you're gonna live, the ways in which you open yourself up to other people, that can have long-term consequences. So I really want to look at, to some extent, how the lack of positive representation in regards to this beauty ideal can, in some ways, and there are psychologists who have agreed with me, sort of bear out as a public health crisis, something that we need to take seriously. And then finally, as I think spelled out in my remarks, I really want to foster sisterhood. And I think that part of the way that you do that is to show that we have these things in common, that we can build relationships upon. Even in the midst of our differences, but that our differences should not be basically the tools of the master should not then, we shouldn't take those on and then use them against each other. So that's where I'm trying to go, but again, how I get there, whether or not these themes even show up in the final piece, I don't know, but that's where my heart is leading.
Got a couple of hands, so 1, 2, 3. Go for it.
Yes, I just actually have a very quick question. First, excuse my iPad.
It's okay.
Your presentation, which is wonderful. A couple of things came up, and I really appreciate the spatial element that you bring out. So as you spoke, I was wondering, there are a couple of people, I know there are a number, but there are a couple of people. One is Neil Roberts, who did this piece, Freedom is Mirage. And he talks about the dialectic of slavery. And for him, the sort of correspondence with you is around the idea of reinterpreting how individuals who were enslaved talked about freedom. And I mean, he talks about it in the context of a group of states who are defining freedom in what they call a new world. And within this new world, you have other sets of people who are creating their own notion of freedom. And in some cases out of the maroon experience, which means that in a place that's supposed to be free, outside of a colonial context now, there's a new understanding of what freedom means. The other person...
He's a political theorist, right?
He actually, it's exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I've started that, and some of it is hard to access for me, but I'm working my way through that.
Yeah, and you know, I think his dissertation, because the way people make folks write dissertation, is clearer than the work that he wrote for this dissertation. So
true.
Yeah. The other person is Daniel Sayers, and Daniel Sayers is an anthropologist, archaeologist, and if you haven't heard of him, he's not that far away. He's the person who's been doing the digs.
The Dismal Swamp
in the Dismal Swamp,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah, I got a chance to meet him.
And the same thing, he's been talking about how these people created a new context because of the specific space they found themselves in, where it had to take into account. And one of the things very interesting is that he proposes a meeting between individuals who chose to stay and didn't run away with those who went to the swamp, because those individuals interacted. You know, those in the swamp would sell, you know, logs and the pitch and the other things that these individuals had been sent into the swamp to get. So he kind of thinks about how do they talk to each other about who's better off.
Right.
So, well, you know, I sleep every night at home, I'm warm, I get food and whatever, and the person who's living in the swamp asks them, are you free? So the spatial element of your work, at least for me, touched a great deal in that. So.
Thank you.
We'll take Petal and Danielle's questions, and then we'll sort of wrap up. We're a little bit behind, but I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you for your papers. And this is just kind of a quick comment and thank you. And that one of the major things that all of your work generates for me is the idea of how intimacies between Black women generate really specific kinds of freedom imaginaries. Because, and I'm thinking in Natalie's presentation about you know, the idea of moving toward the sort of latter end of the clip when you're thinking about how can we kind of think in terms of sisterhood, think about standards of beauty, you know, in a way that kind of strengthens the bonds of sisterhood between Black women as opposed to kind of what is in place now. And in Alicia's paper, it was so striking that one of the kind of parallel reasons for, I forget the name of the... Susan.
To re-enslave.
To choose to be re-enslaved is that her partner, her comrade, and I forget what was the language that she used.
Yeah,
that she's lost her.
Yeah.
And so it makes me kind of wonder that if she hadn't lost her, or if this is signaling a way that the way she envisions freedom plays out differently in the presence of this woman that she feels a kind of intimacy and closeness to. And then in Nicholas's paper, there's a moment when you reflect on the heart tattoo, the PV, and the way that kind of generates this sort of beautiful vignette you present for us in the end of imagining her walking through the halls and kind of fraternizing with other women and thinking about strategies of survival and placemaking and homemaking. So I just wanted to say that you've all kind of illuminated for me the ways that taking sisterhood seriously, critically, can generate new freedom imaginaries, because I think there are ways that epistemologically it's very difficult for us to sometimes think through women's, particularly Black women's, friendships, intimacies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talks. I had a question and a comment. So for Natalie, I think watching the film, one of the questions that I've really resonated with me first off, and then raised the question for me, since there's a lot of conversation about how we make space for Black women's sexual liberation, sex positivity, while simultaneously acknowledging this question of visibility and invisibility. So that how do we distinguish between something that feels like a coercive right, existence or a coercive way to be recognized, and something that is about liberation. Yeah. So I think that's a question that I have. And Alicia, when you were answering, I think the first question, and you said that in the archive, it seemed like the lives of these women felt detached, right, from their families, and which makes sense in the histories, and I know that you're studying a particular era, a particular antebellum era. It made me think of a book that I was reading about the history of Black suburbia, if you will, sort of how we understood suburban spaces before whiteness became synonymous with suburbia, which is, basically the pre-World War II era. And as part of the Great Migration, there's this book by Andrew Weiss called Places of Their Own. It's about the histories of Black suburbanization. And one of the things that was striking when you said that was that there were these single women who left the South and actually had established homesteads together in the outskirts of northern cities prior to World War II, and that was part of their freedom practicing, like the roots of a lot of women's societies and all of these sorts of entities that we see today kind of arose out of those kinds of sisterhoods as well, right? I mean, arose from various places, but that was one of the spaces in which you would see these detached, right, from nuclear family, women coming together and placemaking together in a different space. And so that was just something that connected.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I say something? I just wanted to speak to the question that came to your mind from the film, because it's a really good point. And there is this tension that certainly comes from someone like Beyonce between sex positivity, sexual freedom, and then this respectability and coercion, as you put it. And that's definitely something, thinking again of what Daryl asked about where will the film go. That's absolutely something that I want to address because Sarah Baartman sort of embodies all of these tensions. And I mean, there are scenes from the film that I show clips from that, when you talk about coercion and not having agency versus having agency, there's a lot to excavate. So I appreciate that. I wanted to say that is, it's something that not only needs to be talked about in terms of what we see in popular culture, but also, I mean, I think it's a part of that competition, that thing that keeps Black women from really getting close to each other, because we're judging each other on, how we're dressed and body shape and all these things that, speak to our perceived or real sexual sexuality, but that really have nothing to do with whether or not we bond. And absolutely, I think that we should be moving towards being supportive of the various ways that we express ourselves sexually and, in every other way. So, yeah, we can't get to sisterhood without dealing with that.
Thanks, everyone. I think we'll end here. No, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you.